just deployed my efforts and AI or something. Everyone, for those who don't know me, I've been Christian State services. We unfortunately had the chair or deputy chair here with us this afternoon. So the first thing that we need to do before we start this meeting is to appoint a chair for today's meeting. So I guess if you're looking for somebody to propose somebody for a second, so over to the committee. We've got seconded. Thank you. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome to the Resources and Employment Scrutiny Committee. Item number 1.
Could you go up to the end of the? I don't know, of course you're in a difficult position saying that.
I think the camera, the sound is the camera. That's the reason why I'm here, because the sound is not being picked up.
No, the camera's there.
Officers advised, I did suggest that when I first came in.
You come from that towards
All the sound. The sound's not so good there.
All right, okay.
We have millions of people.
I am trying to be helpful.
They would want to listen to
That is my word.
Thank you. So just to advise members, officers and the public that this meeting is being live streamed and there will be a subsequent broadcast by Council's YouTube channel. And then members of the press public may report and take photographs except where they are confidential items. Item number 2, apology. I've received an apology from Council Lisa Trickett. I believe Council Barbara Green is on the way to late. Item number 3, declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest? Item number 4, action notes in the meeting on 7th of October. I'm assuming you've all read these prior to meetings. Any issues to raise?
Rapt attention.
Thank you. Everything is here now. Item number 5, financial monitoring, quarter 2, month 6. I'll hand over now to Councillor Tristan Chatfield, Cabinet Member for Finance and Resources, and Sarah Finn, Director of Finance. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this is, members will be familiar with the format. So the quarter 2 report has been circulated. I won't go through line by line in detail. I'm sure you're used to my presenting style by now. But of course, we'll welcome questions. A couple of highlights, if I can. Obviously, we're still reporting an overspend. This report, that overspend sits at 10.2 million, which is a significant improvement of some 17 million on what we were forecasting for the previous quarter. So the direction of travel has improved. There is obviously some distance to go, and obviously the senior leadership team and council, both members and officers, are working together to make sure we close off that £10 million gap before the end of the financial year, which we are confident we will be able to do. But I would stress there are still significant budget challenges facing us next year, result of a combination of factors, including loss of income, various obviously COVID-related factors as well. And there's more detail though in terms of risk in the report. So I think I'll probably leave it there. I would like to, if I can, briefly mention some high budget and spending review. I think since we last met, the budget and spending review has taken place. I think it's probably worth just mentioning a couple of things to us. Obviously, at this stage, we've only got national headline figures, so we haven't got the exact figures per local authority. But obviously, we've made some effort to extrapolate that. And so we think there will be an additional 36.9 million additional resources annually from 2022, 23 to 2024-25. There are offsets obviously by some additional expenditure of around 2.3 million, including things like minimum wage increases and covering off inflation. But obviously inflation remains a very live risk. I'm sure all members will be aware of recent inflation figures. We are heading very much in an upwards direction, and that obviously faces risk for us as an organisation in a whole range of ways, not only our direct costs, but also our supplier costs as well. So there's a real increase in core spending power around 3%. Of course, that is making assumptions around the precept. We are used to the way this government behaves in terms of announcing figures, and one of those is to assume that every local authority will take the council tax increases and the social care precepts. And then were to take that social care precept, that'd be an additional 3.9 million, but obviously that's a political budget decision that will be made in due course. So I think that's it really. So I've got further details on as well, members want to share more things. There are obviously further pressure around the continued negotiation around the increase in salary discussion, the annual settlement, and those discussions are ongoing between trade unions and the national negotiating body. And we'll report back on that as soon as we possibly can, because that obviously poses a risk for us, as we did not include a assumption of pay increase for our staff in our budget this year. So there is a potential pressure there as well. Well, there is a pressure, we just don't know the quantum yet. But I think I'll leave it there, hand over to Sarah. So you can think out. No. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Tristan. Thank you, Sarah. Paul, question?
2.3, and it's also mentioned in 1.3 in the annex, which is the savings target of 36.7. You identified that you've got 19.8 on track, and you've got 14.1 anticipated. We all live with the glories of anticipation, don't we? And you've still got 1.8 to be identified. However, in the annex under 1.3, you've got 5.7, which is identified as amber risk. Believe me, Tristan, believe me.
No, I know every line.
Of course you do, of course you do. Where is the amber risk? Because obviously that is the, if you put that together with the 1.8 to be identified, you're talking about 7.5 million.
Can we take them one at a time?
Any more questions?
Well, I've got quite a few actually.
Do you want to go?
Okay, I didn't want to hug the.
We'll do 3 at a time, then I'll hold the meeting.
Okay. 4.1, you've got an overspend of 10.2. And you say that there is still time to make those savings. We are 2/3 through the year. To identify 10.2 savings, if you take it to the start of the year, you'd have to identify 30.6. So I think you've got to run very, very hard on that. 4.7, you've got CCTV costs of, in round figures, $750,000. And this is, again, mentioned in para 2.25 in the annex. It's a simple question. Is this going to be covered by central control? Is there going to be any staffing implications by the upgrading and the, and I see a shaking head there, so I'll take that as being okay. And then no doubt somebody will mention the capital receipts and everything, but the other thing that caught my eye was, well, there were 2 issues. First was the business rate deficit. On page 41, which is identified at 100.7, and you expect the deficit to be of the order of 20.3. And then you've got on page 48 a debtor profile of a sundry debtor profile. It's titled of 81.7. Now, if I was running a business and I'd get a debtor sundry profile of 81.7, I might just get slightly worried.
Yeah, okay. Okay, cool. Carry on. I'll take the easy ones first. The CCTV staffing implications, I'm not aware of any, but I will check the service area to ensure there hasn't been There has been none described, as you rightly say, we have the facilities in place. So it'll be a case of whether there's additional
Just
demand
leaving
to
it.
go into the saving control centre. So I don't anticipate there is any. But check.
The details of that. There's a report to December cabinet with details of that proposal. There shouldn't be any revenue implication.
Okay, all right.
There'll be more detail.
On the 10.2, the remaining, there are a number of actions that have been taken corporately to ensure that we are doing everything we can to close off that 10. Some of them will be fairly obvious things, like making sure there is no expenditure that isn't essential or pre-agreed and pre-programmed. And then the general approach, we continue to work to drive down both the workforce savings as part of the savings programme, but also part of that 10.2 reduction is around controlling those establishment costs as well. So that's in terms of things like the classical kind of holding vacancies, but also making sure that we do as much as we possibly can to keep control over interim consultants, agency spend, contingency workforce spend, is all put together. So there's actions in place. I said 10.2 million is, I know it's a very, very large sum in material terms to any normal person, but in terms of the budgetary organisation as a whole, the budget, some of them terms the percentage, 0.3%, something like that. So manageable in the context of the overall budget. But obviously what we're doing is making sure we will obviously get to zero at the end of the year. We're making sure we get to zero in a controlled fashion rather than having to make any hasty decisions in a future form. On the savings, I'll bring in Sarah if I can, just to outline the savings profile. The last thing I'll just say is on the business rates deficit, the challenge around business rates and council tax collections is one of the reasons why we're facing a financial challenge next year. So it's big, it is a risk, it is a big organisational risk, and we're doing obviously everything we can to drive that down. In terms of sundry debt, I think we did a report around sundry debt, and I think that was circulated, I think.
Not, it's on its way. We were asked last
Yeah.
The last meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, check that, maybe.
Yeah. Once more detailed breakdown. Definitely. I think that was emailed to us.
Okay, I knew it was on the way also.
It was last two.
And then just to picking up on what action we're taking around those adverse savings lists.
Yeah, so 5.7 million relates to workforce savings. So, we've had £20 million overall savings to achieve workforce. Of that, we've found 15 million so far. There's another 5.7 to achieve. We're deeming that to be an amber risk, so saying that is doable by the end of the year. We've saved 15 now. And that will be part of our control measures in terms of how we get there at the end of March. So we're pretty confident we will get that savings target.
Any more questions for Megan?
Can I just say before we start, and it's for Christian, if we're going to persist in using this room for these meetings, can we have them properly provisioned with IT equipment? I mean, we're sitting here, everybody's reliant on their laptops, and yet we have no power. And that's a pretty basic requirement, isn't it?
Yeah. It's essentially there.
Yeah, you got one there, but this ain't working, and the device with the wall socket. I don't know, but I don't really want to have to spend all afternoon. When we spend what we do on offices, I don't really want to have to spend all afternoon trying to work out where there's more power. I mean, the room could just be properly provisioned to run a committee meeting. I was just going to ask Tristan, if I may. You know, there was some publicity recently about non-collection of council tax, and I think we're running at about 93% at the moment. Recognising these are people who can be put in prison for non-payment. Can you tell us why it hasn't been collected and how much is outstanding at the moment that you should have collected? I know it kind of overlaps with the sundry debtors, but I guess you've probably got that information.
I'm not sure, Chair. I'm not sure I've got the numbers to hand. I would say though that I think it's always, and it is a challenging, council tax collection has always been challenging for us because there is always that can't pay, won't pay, and obviously those who can't pay, we make every effort to support them to make new payment structure. And obviously we use bailiff companies as a last resort to pursue those. And I would say bailiff industry is perhaps quite different now to what it was 10 years ago, maybe. There's a lot more regulation around it now. It's a lot more control process. There are a lot more restrictions on how bailiffs can behave, so it's not quite as extreme perhaps as that doesn't sound. But there is obviously always going to be a group of people who pay late because they are struggling. Then there is also a group of people who pay late because they don't want to pay months ago. And obviously it's right that we take every procedure against them, step against those. I think I'll get you the figures, and perhaps what also might be useful for committee is something around how other core cities fare in this approach as well, just so you can see that we're not an outlier. And if that's reassuring or not, then we can come back and have a further conversation about it.
I'm just thinking that we're 10 million adrift, which, to be fair, is not that bad in the context of the overall efforts. But I'm thinking that I bet we could make up most of that if we got our collection percentage up somewhat.
Yeah, and obviously there's a difference between the in-year collection rate and then what we collect in future years from those debting individuals, because a lot of that won't come back. It won't end up being nearly 7%. We never collect. There will be actions taken in future years to collect that. And so obviously it's a debt profile function, shrink over time. As I said, let's try some analysis of it, and I can give you some reassurance then about the process. And if we are an outlier, but you're right in the sense that I would say that obviously the example of people who won't pay, they should pay, obviously, and we should take every step in our powers to ensure they do. And I hope we are taking every step. I'll go away and get some reassurance we are taking every step. Those who are struggling, obviously, it is really right. We put in place mechanisms to support those individuals.
Yeah, because I mean, of course, there's two reasons why you can't pay. There's one because you absolutely can't pay, or it might be because you spent money on something else. Either way, I agree with you. I mean, no sensible organisation goes into the proceedings and bailiffs if there's any other way of avoiding it. And I think perhaps a payment schedule, whatever it takes really whatever it takes really to release that money from those individuals with the least amount of hassle and damage. So.
I said, and the vast majority of tenants, our residents, pay their council tax as they are expected to, and they pay it on time. And these days, with the joys of direct debit, it's a pretty automated, straightforward process. Now, obviously, as I said, there will always be exceptions. I'll give you some figures as how it's
even though it's outrageously high.
Well, that's a question. I mean, I would say there's a strong argument for fundamental reform of how local taxation works. Whether that will result in less taxation being paid, I suspect you might have a slightly different view. But a fairer system that takes into account the assets and overall wealth of the individual rather than what their property was valued at in 1991, whatever it is, might be a slightly more sensitive and modern approach.
I agree that it requires change. Let's not debate today how we did that.
Yeah, before I interject, I noticed that mobile phone was set up. Jane, this is protocol for if there's any mobile phones that go off in meetings or meetings, £20 penalty needs to be paid.
Is that right?
Well, £20 needs to be donated to Lord-based charities.
That's not an issue for me. Is that customer practice? Then I'll follow customer practice.
Just on the council tax, Tristan, it was Birmingham doesn't have the highest rates on collections. That's because we are the largest authority in the country. I think it was 31 million this year. So in essence, for every £100 in Birmingham, 93.60 was paid, compared to an England average of 95.7. The collection bonus rate is actually in Liverpool, is 83.80. But obviously this year, in the midst of a pandemic, there's going to be issues happening with people are impacted by all sorts happening. So it can be understandable, but I agree with Councillor Jane. We do need to have a more robust approach in trying to collect as much council tax. Also make provision for those people who aren't able to afford council tax, and that's what we need some government support. We can basically help those who can't support. But there is an inquiry being launched nationally, I think, filtered through to the council. Is there any more questions before I ask one or two questions myself? Okay, just on 4.14, Tristan, of the report that you've given to us was published on the 9th of November. A week later, on the 17th of November, the inflation rate for October was actually released. That was 4.2%, much higher than everyone anticipated. In fact, 1% higher than the rate in September, double the rate the Bank of England has a target rate of 2%. So as such, the policy contingency for the rise may have to increase more so than that's what's been agreed in this report. And if you can just let us know if there's going to be an impact on employment costs going forward, because the rise in inflation will have a knock-on effect, the rise in interest rates going forward. So I'm assuming we're locked in with all that debt. 4.15 policy contingency for city service outcome. We are in a competitive field. We've had a presentation by city service. We need to support the community as possible we can. But I'm a bit bemused by the need for communications. I think it's an officer in the CG Games. Surely, as a council, we're Richfield officers in communication. We can probably take on that and save us some money. And 4.19. Is it possible that we can have a detailed report as the Resource Finance Committee around the Investor Save initiatives at the future meeting, perhaps in January or February next year? I'll ask two more questions and I'll let you come in. Appendix A, reports of two financial reports. 1.6, there's £1 million internal mitigation within grant maintenance. Do we actually know what that is in reference to and the impact that will have on the city? On specific parts of the city. The final one's 2.9 in the Appendix A. There's a reference to Utility Arena Birmingham. Sorry, there's a reference to the NIA. Surely that's Utility Arena Birmingham now. We changed the name. So why are we still using the old name? And I'm still a bit unsure why we're seeking to replace that. Surely that's the responsibility of the NEC for the parent group. If you can take them, and I have one or two more.
Okay, well, let's take those. I lost track of the last year. I have to bring us back to where the last one was. Anyway, inflation rate. Obviously, inflation will have, and I spoke before, inflation will have an effect. We have contingencies. It's a matter of constant, analysis and check. The problem with inflation rate coming through is it won't come through all at once. So the issue is a lot of our contracts with their preset, because they're not subject to inflation pressures except in extreme circumstances. But obviously it will drive immediate costs, obviously in terms of fuel prices or anything else. And also that feeds through into things like city service that you mentioned. Those inflation rates do create a risk. There seems to be a view that there will be a peak of inflation that will diminish quickly into next year. Whether that is accurate, I'm not an economist, I don't know, but that seems to be the consensus of the Bank of England and the committee that supports the Treasury. In terms of interest rates, obviously I'm sure you'll be aware interest rates have been kept on hold. That obviously the Bank of England interest rates. And at the moment that seems to be their position. I would anticipate, as I'm sure many people would, interest rates will rise at some point. But obviously it's guesswork as to when that will be. But obviously we have a very careful treasury management process and setup that ensures that our exposure will be as limited as is possible. A very cautious approach that limits our exposure. As you're right, it's modelled over time. Therefore, any increase in interest rates should have a reasonably minimal impact across the organisation. But obviously there will be some interest. But there will be some impact. But that is speculative, quite honestly. In terms of investor save propositions, I don't see any reason why we can bring that to committee. Formal request for yourself and the chair for Jane, and I don't see any reason why we can't pick that up. And the last one, sorry, you're right, it has changed its name to utilities. I think it's changed its name several times, to be honest, so if you can keep up, you're doing better than I can. The grounds maintenance question, I will take that away. I'm feeling that was actually raised in another form, but I forget possibly counting. But we'll get an answer. What's the specific question on grounds maintenance is?
Basically, we just want to know what it is, because we get told after the event. So it would be nice to know where the million applications are. I think we had this issue a few years back where a few playgrounds were closed and we weren't sure of what the stage was. And again, our local members have been consulted on the plans to impact one part of the city. Is it just to do with the strategic parts of the city? Is it to do with all parts of the city? We need more meetings.
I think that was a staffing restructure, so for the ultimate game for service, yeah, but I'm not sure. I don't think the intention was I wouldn't have a service impact, members would be noticeable for the members.
Just on that replacement track at the Utility Arena Birmingham, NEC at the parent group, why are we paying for that?
I don't know.
There was a
We can't report.
This is the metro tracks.
It's events that take
The
place.
events that we want to bid for.
Part of the, I think it's part of the original contract that we had,
Yes, yes.
So we continue with the,
that we've got to provide 80 days and we've got to provide the track from memory.
And the track meets up.
That's not that, that's
The truck that we install and take away, so to leaving the event. Right, so we put it in, and we probably should be taken away. That's what the negotiation at the moment, we just bring it and take it away. That's what we do, it's the content of the agreement. That's just what they say.
okay, on 2.21, there's a reference to construction costs being increasing. I think we speak to any residents, to any businesses, they will tell you construction costs have gone, material costs, and not on monthly, but on a weekly basis. Sometimes you'll go in and buy some things on Monday, by the time you go back to get the addition on Wednesday, the cost has gone up. And there's a reference there to monitor closely during the coming months. It should really be weeks, days even. Just want to know how we're monitoring that. Because obviously, within the report, there's lots of construction taking place around the city with the cost of the spiral. Even in Bromford Revival, the regeneration project, and the cost of spiral, and that was a reference to that as well. 2.22, obviously, we're all pleased that we've received the 19.94 million was paid for the Dudley Road transport scheme around that. So we've got that. But the question again is around material costs. Is that now sufficient from the time when the bid was put in to be able to cover the entire cost of that project around the transportation? In 2.24, there's a reference to a small number of high-value cases. That's in terms of capital receipts. Is it possible? I mean, I know obviously with the confidentiality around asset sales, is it possible to have a private report so that we know as members what those small high-value cases are? Because, you know, and the process is involved, whether it's an auction, whether it's a tender, we need to have more information because they're public assets. And then on 3.10, there's a reference to Oscar Gardens. And just want to know if that project has gone through the planning now. Someone come back to us on that because that's pertinent in the savings program going forward. If that project isn't lifted off the ground, we're going to have a problem. And 3.11, I'm really pleased that Shelforth won an award for outstanding contribution to diversity and inclusion, the Asian Business Chamber of Commerce. Just out of curiosity, there's a reduction in fire doors required in the city. If we could just have some information around that. And the final one for I've got several questions. I'll give you this one. 3.16. There's a large increase in the Sever Care budget. I'm assuming that's around hospital discharges. The fact is, more people are probably staying at home and in residential care homes because of the pandemic. And if we have seen such a large increase, are we now going to budget for that going forward?
We'll take that last one first. I understand that's being driven by people leaving hospital and then the enablement costs around that. So supporting them back onto their feet effectively in hospital. And obviously because of COVID, it's affected a lot of people and then come home, be supported in the first few years. Fire doors, I'll get you some more. I'll get you some more information about where we are with Shelforce and fire door contracts. Both a big fan of Shelforce and what it does. The Dudley Road scheme and cost of supplies. I'll bring them over in a second just around those, but I would just say, as I said previously, it is very much live and it is obviously down to individual contract managers managing their own contracts and being aware of supply costs. And then if supply costs are putting pressure on the project, then decisions have to be made about the scope of those projects. And that's the real world we're living in at the moment. That's the reality of the position we're in. There's obviously mitigations you can put in place, so a lot of it is about getting upfront demand, so getting your orders in early, getting ahead of the supply chain. I know we did some really good work around that with the Alexander Stadium rebuild in terms of getting the steel orders in quickly, efficiently and early. Therefore, we haven't been under the pressure that some other large building contractors have been under because of that around those costs. But obviously, as I said, it is causing friction throughout the whole system at the moment. So there will be, I have no doubt, pressures coming forward around individual schemes. But I'll really go more specifically on the Dudley Road scheme.
On the ones, that's more semantics. We want to give the impression that we're going to do this for months rather than 2 weeks in the stop. So we are not solving this on a virtually daily basis and discussion about it. And then that's good to discussion that's good as well. So we are discussing it. I'm not really, it's a medium term issue, but that's going to go away in the next few weeks. In terms of W Road, we did a full business case, a draft business case last March, which was an application to the government and then we got funded. Obviously now that the funding is being agreed, this will come back to cabinet hopefully in March or in February with the revised costings. Hopefully there was enough contingency within that, or we may need to just change some of the step around. That's what we have to be done within that.
So within that 19.94 million, is what I'm interested in. Do we put contingency in case the cost would?
There's always contingency built in.
No, we can spend for us. So given that that was in March of this year, and the scheme will probably kick off March of next year, it's going to cost a lot more. So is that
Well, that'll be within the full business case. What we do with it, if that identifies that we get then we solve what it impacts before we bring it. So this is a live principle. Even within the full business case, we'll still be contingency even at that stage as a project. So it's
More for any more?
we've always got more Tristan.
Why not? I just thought at some point the committee will want to go home.
I did promise Councillor Barry would be off by 3:30.
Checks in the post.
I intend to stick to that.
No, that's
There's a lot of information within the report around the CAS and the annex, around revenue, the future projections. As a committee, I think it would be useful if we again had a paper around the proposed spend, locations of people who have paid the CAS, locations of people who have paid the penalties even. Because, we need to know where people come from. If our communication is working, projection increase in revenue once the exemptions are lifted. Some exemptions are for 12 months, some for 24 months. So we projecting going forward 2 years. And obviously, the whole idea of the introduction of the CAS is to reduce health inequalities, improve the health and well-being of people. So, which will effectively, a lot of people will be using public transport or upgrading their vehicles if they're able to do so. So again, is that within the projections going forward? And most will obviously need to know where the money is going to be spent. 3.41, there's 6 million from the public health grant to release for COVID-19 related spend. My question here is that, do we have a breakdown from the Director of Public Health where that 6 million is being redirected from within that grant with this new funding that's being made available to the public health plan itself? In 3.72, 2.5 million is going to be set aside to fund an increase in appeals provision. Is that specific to Birmingham or other councils or cities also setting aside some money for that? 4.3, we've asked, dealt with that. Annex 2, there's a writing of £893,792.25 of commercial rent charges from 2003 to 2020. I'm assuming whenever we lease our properties or give licenses on properties, we carry out due diligence on the tenants, have guarantors in place, and carry out extensive work to collect any outstanding debt. So again, that's something that I think would be useful more so than even the council tax collection to see, because these are people who should be able to afford the rent because they kind of due diligence on it. If we could have something back to committee on that. And the final part is Annex 4C, the budget for the Alexander Stadium and the organising committees and change. The chair actually received a letter from the chair of the audit committee, Councillor Fred Greenwald, around issues related to partner contributions towards the Common Games. So are we able to update the committee today around the partner contributions to the Commonwealth Games? And if not, can we add this with members on agreement as an item agenda for the next meeting in January? Over to you, Tristan.
Yes, let's go through. I'll go backwards if that's all right, Chair. Partner contributions to the Commonwealth Games. I was unaware of that letter, but there's no reason why we can't add it to the agenda.
Yeah, that was good for the audit because last year the external auditors are reviewing value for money assessment of Commonwealth Games, identified that the council had identified a certain level of funding from partners. At the end of last financial year, hadn't yet been forthcoming or pledged. Therefore, the auditor said to the council, what are you doing about that £25 million gap that you've got? So as a result, the council then, through the capital programme, put up 25, the council then put up £25 million, saying that if partner funding did not come forward, the council has 25 million within its capital programme to make up that. It doesn't deserve the fact that we are still assuming those partner contributions. And I think that's still going well, so I'm going to update that we can bring back where those.
Yeah, if you can just bring us a report just to detail where the partner contributions were initially agreed, what we're doing to pursue those contributions, if they're not going to pay them, that we're going to use and ultimately.
Yeah, the auditor's concern was that where we get the money from, we've got that money, so the auditor's happy now. We still have the issue that we should.
But we also want to know why partners initially agreed and everything. Let's come back on the others.
Yeah, sorry. Absolutely, yeah. So in terms of council tax, if we discussed council tax arrears earlier, and what steps we are taking there, it makes sense to bring something around business rates as well together into a single report. In terms of the public health, that's 6 million. I think is the reserve held within public health. Public health is a ring-fenced grant, so use fewer things. Broadly speaking, it's a self-contained budget, and therefore it doesn't have implications for the general fund. In terms of the CAS, again, we can get you whatever additional information that the committee would require for the CAS. I don't think that'll be an issue within reason, obviously. I think there are a number of separate schemes that have CAS funding as identified as part of them, but obviously that's always subject to what we come with the right. Whilst the implementation has been very successful, it would be wrong, I think, to make any rush judgments about where it's going to be in 2, 5, 6 years. You can forecast as best we can, but that's never going to be 100% to go forward. What we think is correct. I think that's.
Just around the fields provision, we've set aside 2.5 million. There's a similar approach adopted by 4 cities in proportion to their fields.
Yeah, that would be a similar position. It's based on a recognised methodology and it's all audited as well. This is all part of our provision for the accounts. It's independently audited by external auditors to provide the same guidelines, so it should be on a similar basis. Obviously, the numbers will be different given their local circumstances.
Thank you for that. Is there any more questions for Tracy or the officers in System 5?
One follow-up.
Councillor Jenkins.
In response to that question about the travel tax, you said that you couldn't charge your income. Can you assure us that you have no plans to extend the extent of the charging and apply the charges to more motorists than would be the case at present?
I mean, obviously it's not my portfolio specifically to make that decision, but I have heard no discussion whatsoever about any changes to the CAS. As I understand it, it is there to do a very specific job, and that is under legislation. That is how it has been set up. Therefore, any change would require both a political decision and a legislative change as well. So as far as that, absolutely no conversations about changing anything.
Just that's one of the questions because obviously less people are now being given, which is good because it means people are changing their commuting habits into the clean air zone. And obviously, some people, when they're able to afford to do so, they're bringing the vehicles. So going forward, nobody should be.
That's always intended. The intention has always been absolutely clear. It is not about making money. It is about reducing the number of harmful pollutants in the city, in those particular the area covered by the clean air zone. And therefore, we would hope, obviously, to reach a point in not too distant future where it is unnecessary and not needed anymore, because it has done its job. Those harmful pollutants have dropped down to safe levels, and those polluting vehicles, partly through the CAS being a deterrent, but also partly through changes in technology, people's changing behaviours generally, because we're not the only clean air zone. There are taxation benefits, etc., to driving cleaner vehicles that are all aimed nationally at changing people's behaviours and reducing the number of those high-polluting vehicles on the road.
Yeah, but ambition now is to get rid of petrol and diesel cars by 2030. Just want to come in, councillor.
There's just one small point, and it's something I raised at the last meeting, and it's still in the agenda as an issue, and that is on page 28. The Children's Trust is short of income by 4.8. I asked the question because there's 1.1 million allocated against income not received from partners, and I asked the question whether this was the NHS partners, and I received an affirmative nod.
Yeah.
Can we chase up the partners? Because I'm sure it would be much better in our bank account than theirs.
I think there's a conversation to have with the Children's Trust, I think, to see what activities being undertaken
Right.
to retrieve those partnership contributions. But I'm happy to take that conversation.
Send a letter.
If you can just come back to us really as to what's being done to try to retrieve. If there's no further questions on item 5, swiftly move on to item 6, medium-term financial plan update. Tristan, over to you again.
So obviously this report, again, you'll be familiar with the format, but essentially this is then, so we've seen the position we're in this year. The MTFP is therefore the position going forward into the future as far as 25, 26. And again, this is part of our more strategic and better financial management of the organisation, is us thinking in the longer term, and that takes us right up to 5-year MTFP. And obviously, this is very much a live document that reflects the impacts in year, but then also any national policy decisions, anything we talked about previously on the budget and spending review, all of these being demand pressures within services, all of this is integrated into the MTFP, which then hopefully puts us in a position to not only understand the risks coming down the line, but also to make sure that we are making decisions in a timely fashion for the future, so we are aware of those risks and we can make financial judgments now, rather than waiting till we get to a position where those matters become pressing and critical for the budget. Again, I won't go through detailed report that's been circulated. Obviously, I'm happy to take questions. I would just point out, I think I've mentioned it before, where we include the Appendix 1, which I think is quite an important thing for us, which is the Budget Risks Appendix, which is an evolving attempt to quantify the budget risks we're facing, both in terms of impact, financial impact, but also likelihood. And then we weight those, and that allows us then to make an informed judgment about that reserve position. So it's not just a case of plucking reserves to figure out the egg, we think that's what it should be. It's now based on what we consider to be the risks, the large-scale financial risks facing the organisation, quantify those risks, and then use that to inform our judgment about that reserve position. And it's quite noticeable that there's been some coverage of other local authorities where their reserve positions have dipped to a position where they are putting themselves at a level of risk because they don't have adequate reserves to cover off the risks the organisation is facing in even the short term. I think this is our attempt to be much more sophisticated approach around it.
Chair, anything you want to add, Sarah?
I think just from my perspective, we've been quite keen to make sure that we are advising members and the wider organisation on a much regular basis about financial positions for future years. So this year we introduced an annual budget process, and so this is the second of those reports. So this is the first time we've done 2 quarters, and so it is an evolving position. It obviously identifies a gap as well as seeking out on those pressures and risks in order to quantify a gap we might want to be working in terms of balancing the budget. So it seems to, I guess we're giving you the worst position at this moment to be able to see what all those things are that make up that gap. We are working towards dealing with that gap, and the next report that goes to cabinet in January will highlight how we have helped that gap. So there is a lot of work to do at the moment with senior officers in that regard.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So I'm just having a discussion with officers around the rules that's emanating from that plan, but we've been advised that we'll switch off the room very quickly. Have to leave it on and bear with the move. Okay, is there any questions for us? Councillor Tilsley?
Question, comment really. I noticed at the bottom of page 82, following the budget, and it is the last couple of lines, the current working assumption is that government funding will be cash flat across the medium term, which effectively means any salary increase for staff is going to have to be found out of the existing budget. And on top of that, if inflation does take off, again, it's an issue that we're going to have to deal with within the existing budget. And then you get caught in the tweezers because you're held down on that side as far as income is concerned. And the presumption is, on page 83, that council tax and business rates will be a reduced level of income. So we are caught in a pincer movement, really, which obviously is going to have an effect upon the services that we can provide.
You're absolutely right, Paul. Disagree with any of that, and that's it. That all that feeds through into the table on table 1, which illustrates that emerging financial gap over the next 4 years, and that's the reality. And a lot of those things you outlined, all of them aren't unique to Birmingham. They are pressures in the sector generally
Across the board, yeah.
And those are the risks we're trying to find ways to cover off. And I would say, from Sarah's point, the actions around the delivery plan in order to close that long-term gap, those delivery plans actions, it's critical for this organisation's that they do that. We need to make sure those delivery plans are implemented and that and they deliver what they are expected to deliver in order to drive down those gaps. And I think I'm absolute confidence we'll do that, but none of that is easy. That's the point. And I think we have taken every effort we possibly can to move away from the salami slicing approach to budget management. However, the position we are facing with all those pressures in future years does mean it's not going to be an easy ride. There will be difficult decisions have to be made.
I'm the guy who had to deal with a reduction of £212 million in 2011.
Well, it reflects very quickly on the fact that for the entire time I've been involved in local government, for the last 10 years, which admittedly is perhaps a few years short of your experience, or only a couple of years short, but in all of that time, our budgets have shrunk. Effectively, in almost every year, effectively our budgets have shrunk in that period. That has been the story about local government for the last, certainly this administration, and as you read around the previous administration as well.
I did have long hair at one time.
I've seen the pictures for them. I can attest to that.
The agreed budgets have been reduced considerably over the last few years, more so since 2010. But in 3.10, there is a good forecast in terms of business rates going forward. It's going to improve by 13.1 billion in 2025, 2026. So we've got an array of developments across the city. Edinburgh is probably the biggest one. And we've got all the developments happening over time. Business rates coming to the city, which is a reflection of the work the city council has carried out in the last few years in working with stakeholders departments across the city. In 3.18, just in terms of adult care packages, it's in the news now that there's a shortage of carers across the city, and the shortage of lots of key workers across the world. At some point, that may be reflected in, obviously, if there's a shortage of workers, they can demand a higher wage. Will that then be reflected in the adult care packages that we administer here as a council? And if so, do we have sort of like a projection of how much that's going to cost? In 3.24, I quite like this. There's a report coming to.
Sorry, Chair. Which number?
3.18. Just talking generally about adult care packages. There's some reflection in terms of the cost of those packages increasing over time, and coupled with the fact that within the pandemic, so there may be more need for care packages. And in 3.24, there's a council is to meet a 25-year capital programme which will be presented in February 2025, the budget. I'm assuming we will have an insight into that in the January meetings. That's something that we will have, and if not, that's something that can go to this committee once it's ready, so we can have a good insight into that. 3.34, there's a reference to public engagement run from mid-October to the end of December. Can you just give us a timeline of the public engagement that has been undertaken during this period? What's happening now? What's going to happen before the end of December as referenced in the report? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll go through order. So in terms of care workers, care working along with a lot of, as you rightly said, not just key workers, but actually across, there is a significant labour shortage in a significant number of sectors, driven by demographics, amongst other factors, competition for workers, etc., which inevitably means that it's inflation. There are inflation pressures, therefore, around wages. It's quite right, it's just the way the labour market works. It's demand for labour, regardless of the minimum wage as well, considerations will increase, and that will have an impact on care packages. And for us, there is additional risk. There is our prices are reasonably low in the city, therefore there is quite substantial risk around them increasing, and that's a danger that we have to be mindful of. But obviously that's going to have to be managed in the context of all our budgets, and we have to find a way to do that. There's been a lot of progress around care packages. I think we've talked before, you would have probably heard Graham Betts, the Director of Adult Social Care, talking before about the way we now work with adult social care clients to work through question stage, where you go through, you ask people what do you need to help you back on your feet? What do you need, rather than just offering people shopping lists? It's about what their individual needs are, and that has had a huge beneficial effect in terms of managing demand around that service. So there is stuff we can do. It's not a completely one-sided equation, if you like. On the capital programme, we know the capital programme.
This is something quite ambitious that we're trying to do. No one council's done this. We're trying to break the cycle of looking at capital in a 1-year vision or a 3-year vision, because when, say, cabinet needs to make cabinet decisions on capital, it has to approve a building or an asset. It's not really well put that in the context of what's a long-term vision, so it doesn't overlap any other development want to do. So we want to try and have a long-term 25-year vision. So it won't be a 25-year budget, because we don't know what the funding will be like. 25 years is such a long time frame if you think about it. But what we want to try and pull out some of those key themes that we need to have as kind of parameters. So we've got the enterprise zone, 25-year program. The HRA is a 30-year business plan. So we've got all of these disparate regulations. The transportation is always a 6-year plan. And then in terms of school places, we've got demographic data around adults, so we can see what need care homes there will be. So we're trying to put all of that information together to give some sort of long-term vision where we think we're going. That won't have the other side of the funding, because funding is totally unknown. We don't know how much capital funding we will have in the future, what those grants will be available, or what the revenue budget will look like. It will give us some sort of context that we'll be doing. So by January, February, we have an overarching vision of some solid numbers. Obviously, we will be in this work in progress. It'll take a bit of time for us to really get into understanding what the needs of each service are, what the needs of our assets are, what the staff acquisition surveys are, what existing stuff are. For example, when they need to be renewed, they've been renewed after 20 years, so we need to start planning for that now. So it's that kind of vision that we're trying to build in. So hopefully what you see in January, February will be a good start towards that. But obviously it's going to be ongoing for a number of years to really get that going. Should be reviewed every year as well.
Yeah, that's really useful. Thank you for that. Some of the budget risks table that we provide is really, really useful. Thank you for that. There is a 40% risk of not achieving capital receipts and or budgeted capital grants. And obviously, with an increase in interest rates, the banks adopt a more robust approach to lending, which tends to reduce the number of potential buyers for larger assets, which tends to lead to lower prices. It's capitalism, that's not words. But you've not actually put any provision in the reserves, because of the risk is around 28 million, but there's no provision.
This is the reserve. Is that really next to the 11? Yeah, it's the 11, which then feeds down onto, at the end of the table, and there's a cumulative number. So we'll really add up to total this one, 123 bottom.
Okay, but in the left-hand column where it says existing reserve provision, it's blank, but you've got it for other
Yeah, we haven't got anything at the moment, so there's no.
So they haven't got anything there, okay.
No specific
Yeah, that
reserve.
was the question.
Then it falls into a general reserve.
Oh.
So we, rather than, it's seen as inefficient economically to start bringing money from each reserve, because not all the risks will materialise at the same time. Therefore, you then add up all the risks potentially, and then you weigh that factor that into it. Because it's inefficient for us to set money aside that we don't need to
So
set aside.
then we need to have a more better understand how you comply with this table, because if you look at the highways tier 5 alternative, in the existing reserve provision, put 200 million, even though the maximum impact of the medium-term financial plan is 50 million.
That's the residual impact.
So the total risk is 250.
250.
Total risk is
250. We've got 200 already, so.
And just on that, didn't we receive a lump sum from the former highways partners around that? I'm assuming that's all now being spent into the new contract. There's some compensation payments that this is finding penalties.
There was that money that's now been back into the reserve figure and for costings. That should be within our.
I think there is a cabinet report due on this fairly soon, I think possibly December. So I think we'll have some good job.
Yeah.
And just the final one, there's a 40% risk of impact of Brexit. That's I'm assuming around potential last year of grants that we were entitled to from there. Do we not have that projected? Because surely we must know by now, around European Union, what we're not going to get, which we initially thought we were going to get.
So,
I think there's still risks around that. So, for example, we know our skills service has a lot of European grants at the moment, so they're still waiting to see what places those European grants. So I don't think we do.
yeah, so obviously we've had the levelling up fund, which was in the past on was trade being compensatory for those lost structural funds for the EU, but it's not the same thing. It covers different areas and it's different criteria. You did ask a question about the public engagement fund budget. Being open, we have slipped on the timetable for October. Purely, that's the ambition to get in October. We've always said we want to get early in the budget process. Because of the financial challenge we find ourselves facing next year, there's a lot more work that's had to be done internally to get us in a position to go out to consultation on the budget. I would say next week we are looking to launch the app, which has been talked about, the social media tool. Should be more details will be circulated. That should be, literally as I said, next week we should be ready to go live with that. And that will be a chance for residents and interested parties to actively participate in the budget making process by prioritising various things like this. It's been used in other local authorities. I mean, Newcastle is the one that's used it, and a couple of others. We're keen to do something a bit different, especially trying to get back to the place and happen backwards, depending on what falls in. That we are trying to engage more youth audience, and therefore, using that more in this technological age, more appropriate way of consulting budget, rather than having a dusty room where we drag in 100 members of the public and make them very similar to this one, and drag them in and let them often shout at us for 2 hours, which doesn't feel overly productive. Because I think this way will hopefully give us a much more nuanced view about how our citizens view the way we prioritise our spending. So it's quite an exciting thing. Hopefully, and we'll get some good data and impact and analysis out of it while we do it. And then hopefully we'll come back and be able to circulate details to members once it's live, and you can go out and tell your residents about this wonderful meeting and they can have a paper.
Thank you for that. Is there any questions for trustee officers?
One if I may. Before I ask my question, I just reflect that once a day, Labour members are complaining about the fact that there have been 10 years of cuts. And Tory members like me are complaining about the fact that taxes are at the highest level in 70 years. And one cannot help feeling that somewhere along the way there must have been a dramatic fall off in productivity for those two situations to coexist. Plus the fact that we've got 4% inflation.
Yes.
Which I suppose if you owe a lot of money, it's good news, and we know who owes a lot of money. Yeah. So we have. It's supposed to be 2%, but it's currently around 4%, and it's anybody's guess whether that is just a temporary impact of business coming back on stream after COVID, or whether that's the new way of things, and 4% is actually the low figure that we expect to climb higher. We just don't know. It's impossible to know. My question, you don't need to answer that. That's just
I was going to as well,
but we'd be here all day.
We would be.
Anyway.
Political as well.
But I just reflect on the fact that,
Boris has spent family silver
Well, 10 years, you're saying 10 years ago, I don't agree with that, but you're saying 10 years ago, you might not agree that taxes are at the highest level in 70 years, but it is a fact. And I say, how can those two things coexist without there being a dramatic drop-off in productivity somewhere? But the question I wanted to ask, in the risk analysis, which is interesting, although I'm not sure whether that's better placed in audit committee, but never mind. You're saying that there's a 20% risk of a cyber attack that would cost us 40 million if it happened, and therefore you put a weighted assessment with a risk of 8 million. Is there really a 20% risk of a cyber attack to that extent?
Well, without having Peter Bishop here, I suspect he would, but that number comes from the, that wouldn't be plucked out of thin air, that would come from the service itself. There are a number of local authorities that have been subject to substantial cyber attacks that have affected equipment, and it has cost them many tens of millions to extract themselves in that circumstance. So obviously, whether it's 20% or not, is, you could argue around, but there is a risk that is, I would say, considerably higher than 1%, possibly less than 50%. You can kind of probably argue around where it sits in between those two things, but the risk, cyber, if you're asking me about the things that keep me awake at night in terms of local authorities financial, cyber attack is one of the relatively small list of things that poses a real critical risk to local authorities.
What do you see as the main people who would be likely to carry that? Are we talking about state actors? Yeah.
I think I'll
just naughty students.
I think I'll be overstretching my. It depends on. I mean, we're going to pay ransomware, but there are different forms of cyber attacks. So if it's your ransomware, then it might be more of a traditional type. But there is also states, as I understand it, there are also state actors involved in some of this activity. And as I understand it, the fact we're hosting your homework games increases our profile, and anything increases your profile, increases your risk.
I think to answer that, 20% is based. I think the chance of a cyber attack is 100%. We always be tracked. The solving bots that are attacked. This is trying to work out an attack that gets through and then hold gets ransom. So obviously that's much lower. It's not one to look at happening. So that's how we got to 20%. Just it's a difficult one to quantify. So the chances of it getting through and then also they're holding this ransom and deciding to make some sort of financial project or causing financial loss.
Yeah. Okay. No, it's your assessment. It just struck me as 1 in 5 is quite high given the seriousness of it. But if that's your assessment, then
that's what it has. But then 40 million again, it's just again like you compensate by keeping 40 million down. If someone does get through, they can to anything.
Given the level of potential penalties that are now available to GDPR breaches, given that if you were a nominal company, your income is what, 1.something billion in terms of per annum, you are potentially exposed to up to 10% of that value. So you could argue that perhaps 40 million is a slightly smaller.
I think compensated that way by increasing the percentage to something slightly really higher than reducing that to the end result. Yeah.
I can just go back a couple. I understand Peter Bishop did go to audit committee and did go through a lot of this.
Peter's doing a lot of work on this.
And also there is just for encouraging for members, there are, I believe, cybersecurity awareness sessions being run for members. So it might be something members which are engaging. I did a session and I'm quite honest, I've been quite scared of my life given some of the stuff that was outlined in that. So I think it's worth it, if nothing else, just to open your eyes to the risk. I know Captain Tim can chat.
Like the rest of them, I'm sure I tried to be really, really careful with these things, although I wouldn't want to say that I could never be called out. We can all make mistakes. But I know that Pete's done a huge amount of work on this. And I am aware that there are, examples where professional hackers have broken down what appear to be sophisticated security barriers in a matter of hours. And on the large majority of occasions, it's because of mistakes by members of staff, clicking on links, accepting invitations. And that appears to be the real weak spot in all the designs. So I think it's right to warn people. But no, I mean, my point is, you said 20%. I accept your estimate. It's frighteningly high, isn't it?
Because just last week, one of the major conveyancing firms in the country, they had a cyber attack. And there's unintended consequential losses, both in financial and non-financial terms. It's something that civil council needs to be aware of. And one of the reasons why we're holding the cyber security course that I attended myself last week is to make that available of that So if we were, and as Mohammed said, I think we're attacked every second, aren't we, as a council? We've got provisions in place in terms of the detection of viruses. James will know more about this than I do, but it's something that we do need to be mindful of. I'm sure it's just a matter of time for a council, whether it's a small, medium, or large-sized council, will be subject to a cyber attack.
It's people as well, clicking on links, giving information that they shouldn't give. And when you piece enough of the information together, somebody can get access to a password that gets them into the system, and then the trouble really starts.
And from an Oracle perspective, we do actively try to hack Oracle on an annual basis. It is a responsibility that we have to employ a professional hacker to see whether we can get in. That's what we do. We do it to ourselves because that's proven to do so.
I know professional hackers who have been convicted of crimes tend to be the most sought individuals by large corporations because they want them to work for them to stop someone else hacking into their systems. Okay, we'll move on if there's no further questions on the medium-term financial plan to our favourite item of the agenda.
We'd like to thank you.
ERP programme update, and we've got James Cooper, the programme director.
Thanks very much. I think we continue as a programme to report Amber. I think I said in the last owners committee, it's likely we will stay there until the programme delivers in April. I think we are a stable Amber, so that's kind of what we call it, rather than a declining Amber. So that is good for us. We've had a pretty good couple of months in terms of reducing our risk profile, and you'll see that in the report around how we've looked at particular risks. But in terms of the particular stresses, I guess, that we have as a programme, we have one piece on the way that we connect with other applications, which is lagging at the moment. We put a lot of effort in to bring it to what we would call a stable red, so there's now a plan in place integration. The outbound. The inbound integration, we've actually finished and tested, so that's encouraging because that was also lagging. We have some stresses with our integration partner in terms of the additional custom pieces, and on the chart that called PaaS extensions, platform as a service extensions, that our supplier is providing to us. And again, we are finding some stresses in India with regard to resources. The market over there is quite hot in terms of people, so they are being poached and moved around. COVID is still fairly prevalent here as well, so that's having an impact. But again, we now have a clear plan for them to deliver for the end of this year, and then to flow into our testing process that we've got. We are ploughing on with our report development. It's one of those things in an ERP where everybody wants their favourite report again, regardless of whether it's actually useful to them or not. So we've had quite a significant challenge. We've reduced the number of reports we're developing down from roughly around about 400 down to about 180. So that's encouraging to see that. I think the optimistic things that have happened, I guess, in the last month is we've had 3 significant testing cycles going on at the moment. One is our user acceptance testing 1, so we can do this cycle twice. And all of the current functional areas of all our finance have exited from that particular testing cycle. I'll just add, though, that the finance one is primarily as a direct result of, I talked about the customizations that our supplier is developing for us. Those have not yet all been completed. So hence, until those are completed, we will hold, if you like, the finance exit. It's a good commercial lever for us with the organisation until those have been done. But the other functional areas, HR, P2P, and payroll indeed, have all exited their relevant test cycles and have met their particular targets that we have. And we will now move on to the second round of testing that they have to do. So that is encouraging.
The bespoke that hasn't yet been delivered, you can't do the user acceptance test until you've got all the bespoke. So this UAT week 4, the one at the end of November, you're going to postpone that until the bespoke's ready.
No, we're not going to postpone it forward. So what we're able to do is we're able to exit UAT, which we've done against that particular timeline, but only for the functional areas that have met criteria. So finance does have a number of custom objects because of the efficiencies that we need to bake into the way that things are processed in finance. They probably have the largest area in terms of those things. It's primarily around about things like enabling officers to keep things in efficiently, so we're not involving a lot of manual processes. Those are the particular things that we do. So it's just in that particular area in finance that we've got to focus on. We do now have a clear data from the supplier around those things and will be delivered. I think the encouraging thing is that our first round of payroll testing has met our targets as well that we expected.
What is the date you delivered this one?
So there are multiple dates. So the last final date is the 22nd of December. So they'll then flow into the next cycle. So that's the trick we've got to try and pull off collectively to that particular component. But we're being drip fed them as we go. So we're not waiting for a very big lump to be delivered. They're coming massively. We've just kicked off our next round of data migration. Again, we met our targets again for the second cycle of data migration. We're now seeing significantly high rates of getting the data out of our current system into our new system, so that's encouraging as well. And we're now starting to look at how we ramp up what we call the adoption and communication activity to people around the council and indeed external organisations, specifically schools. We have roughly about 23,000 people in schools that we will either upset because we can't pay them correctly or pleased because we can pay them correctly. And we're also going to give them some potentially some additional functionality in terms of how they interact with our schools as well. And we also have obviously people that we pay in BCT and the Children's Trust as well, which is something that we need to focus on. So data migration again, which is one of our biggest challenges, we're seeing some good results in terms of what we've got. We are going to extend a couple of our milestones. So this is a recent thing in terms of the chart, the school programme milestones reporting. We're going to give the second cycle of UAT, so milestone 5, we're going to extend until the 7th of January. And the completion of payroll comparison 2, we're also going to extend until the 7th of January as well. We just want to give a little bit more time to enable those 2 key cycles to complete. For our next round of payroll testing, we need to hit a target of at least 85% in terms of an overall comparison between accuracy, so it's important that we get there. But I think the other milestones currently we're forecasting remain on track. I talked a little bit about risk, so you've got this thing called RAID dashboard, risk assumptions, issues and dependencies. As you can see, we've managed out a number of the open risks that we've had, and we've also managed out a number of the open issues that we've had as well. So that's moving in a useful direction. However, there still are some significant risks that we're managing, particularly around any further delays to data migration, which we're not seeing at the moment, but just keep an eye on that one. There are a number of technical solutions that we have to get right, how we map data. But I think the other one is this is now a moment in a program of this kind where people start to remember all the things they forgot to ask for when they were asked to ask them at the beginning when we designed the system. So it's one of those things where change is going to be our killer if we're not careful. So part of my role now, unfortunately, is to say no quite a lot, quite significantly. And we're starting to say that. So it may well mean that there are certain features that people have suddenly remembered that they might want, that they won't be able to have until say or ongoing. And so that's quite difficult to say no to people. It's quite difficult for their favourite widget that they've had and suddenly got about and remembered again. But that's where we are now as a programme, gone through our first cycle of testing, and it's difficult now to start to introduce change into a programme of this kind. So that's going to get harder now for the organisation, and that will create some interesting conversations around the organisation about how we do that and what we do in terms of that. So, and it may also introduce a little bit of inefficiency come April, because we might have to come up with a manual process rather than the automated one until we get to that particular point. So that's something which we're always particularly mindful of. We remain within our budget in terms of the allocated monies that we've had. We're still running with some of our contingency fund left, and we're also still running with some reserves that we carried forward from previous years. So at the moment, our budget position remains within where we said it would be. We went back for our business case in March of this year. And I think there was a question last time about, are we learning the lessons as we go? It's an interesting program from that perspective. And I think the answer is yes. At every key phase exit point that we have, where we go from one particular type of work to another particular type of work, we do something called a lessons learned. That is, 2 or 3 hours, we get the whole team in the room. We look at the things that we can do better. And I've just included a little bit here around the lessons learned, some of the key ones that we've had and that we will continue to work on. And we keep this log that goes into our activity plans as well to make sure that we are continually refining it, particularly in areas like where we're migrating data and how we do that more efficiently. That's probably my summary on this particular occasion. There's more information in the appendices about the specific testing cycles, where they are, where they have landed in terms of what we've done. We talked a little bit about ECT, stands for payroll comparison testing. That has come out and met its targets. And likewise, UAT1, bar the exceptions that I've done, have also completed. SIT2, system integration testing 2 as well, has completed, and all of the inbound integration, so the ones that come into Oracle, have been tested as well. The defect resolution of that is ongoing. We talked about data migration, and there's also some information in there around how we're looking at the particular adoption activity that we're going into. So what did we set out to do as a program initially, and how are we moving now to train people in the system and to look at how they can use the technology to the best of its ability. I think one thing that's useful to bear in mind is that whilst we have 43,000 employees that this technology will support, the vast majority of those will only use a very thin slice of this technology on a daily basis. It will be people such as in finance or in HR and in payroll that will really use the depth of functionality that exists within Oracle to do their day-to-day work. So for us, we want to make sure that we're really efficient in terms of how we help people, the majority of people, to use the technology just to do the things they need to do. And those things are things like look at their payslip on a monthly basis, update their personal details, update their bank details. Those are the basic things. And Oracle as an application is quite intuitive in terms of how you use it. It is very app-like in terms of how it operates now. So for those simple things, we're using guided learning, self-guided learning to do that. And within the tool itself, there is like some artificial intelligence that helps you as you're going through screens to guide you in terms of what you want to do next. So that adoption activity now is starting to ramp up in terms of things you want to do as you try and tie down all the loose ends that you've got going on with the technology. I'll pause for questions.
Thank you, James. Any questions for James?
I just noticed in one of the organisation lessons learned is that you need full organisational buy-in. I don't know if that lesson really needed to be learned again.
Well, I think actually, and for me as someone who has come into this programme, I think there are some cultural challenges in Birmingham around, people being more corporately compliant about doing things in a particular way. And I think that one of the things that we're trying to bake into our adoption is to show people that if you don't do it this way, it's not going to work. And if you shout about it, it's not going to work. The first question we're going to ask you is, how are you doing that? Are you doing it in the way that technology is asking you to do it? So I know it's a slightly blinding flash look at this, but actually for us, it's where we start from.
Okay. I mean, trouble in that there's requests for changes and obviously at this stage. But the other thing I wanted to ask is, we were told that there's a £500,000 extra spend on the legal product. And I've had 2 people attempt to answer me, and I still remain unconvinced that that was necessary. But that's not to say it wasn't necessary, that nobody persuaded me that it was. And I think that someone somewhere is trying to cover up a screw up that has led to us having to extend the equity fund. Again, are you able to explain to me why we need to extend?
No, I mean, we don't use it with this technology.
So that's it.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's a legacy product. Because we're running late, we're having to pay more license fees and support on the SAP system. And I'm questioning how much of that £500,000 is a real need to extend it, and how much of it is another screw up somewhere.
I mean, I can certainly go back and talk to Peter about that and understand what's the logic behind making that decision. But for us as a technology, for Oracle, basically all you need is a browser. You need a browser and an email address. That's all you need. Everything else is, to some extent, silent.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it's an old. We moved away from it on a browser-based system, but we had a. We knew when we would finish Reliance on SAP, and we missed the target date. Now, I understand that as a consequence of that will cost us money, but I'm not sure what, and we worked all that out, and there was an extra budget went through in March. So why now another £500,000 on revenue fund? No, well, no, just as no, you don't know. I don't know when the commission was, but the other time we meeting.
I'm happy with I'm.
Yeah.
Not just that, and obviously from the implementation phase, it was 90 million initial forecast. We actually nearly doubled, wasn't it?
It has from the original business case, yes. I mean, the full business case that went back to Cabinet in March was very clear about what the forecasting condition is.
Okay, and then you've also said in the report that there's a gross saving reached of 10.918 million, which is less than the increase that you've had in terms of implementation. But that's the gross saving. Do you have a net saving?
No, because at the moment, the way we work the savings when we went back to the business case in March was we stripped out what's colloquially called the arms and legs savings. So, it's saving an arm of someone and legs someone else in terms of just doing a subset of their particular role. And just looked at what's the pure and simple replacement saving that you could make from running technology called SAP as opposed to cloud technology called Oracle. What we can't forecast is how those savings then get transferred. We do know that we have to make a £2 million saving per annum against the rate of the swap out that we've got. At the moment, we've identified approximately 1.6 million that we know is going to be allocated against that 2 million. So we are pretty close to that target that we set out in the business case.
Is there any further questions for James? Okay, we're back anyway in January. So thank you for that, James. Unless you want to stay, more than free to leave now. Item number 8, work programme. This is for discussion members. That agreed, and obviously we've had a discussion around some further report that we bring back to the committee, which officers are now aware of, so if you can chase them through, please. Date next meeting, item 9, it's at 2 p.m. 20th of January, back here again. Item 10, request for calling. Petitions, council for action, nothing. Item 11, under urgent business. No. Item 12, authority to chair and officer in an urgent situation, duly with the chair jointly with the relevant chief officer as authorised track on behalf of the committee. That's Councillor Mohammed Iqbal. Councillor. Is that agreement? Great. Thank you.